Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Welcome to episode 72 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm Esther, and I am here today with my co-host, Holly. Hey, Holly, I'm so glad to have you back.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's been
me back.
Today, we're going to actually be diving into a new series on communication, but it's been several episodes since you've been with us, Holly. So I just want to say I'm really glad that we can be recording again together. And for anyone who follows along, I'm sure that they've been missing your wonderful perspective and your laughter. So,
well, thank you. I don't know about that, but I appreciate the kind words.
So, okay, well, let's jump into our topic for today. So we are wanting to talk about communication. In this first episode, we're just going to kind of introduce the topic and get into why we're talking about it. So we really believe that communication is one of the most important aspects of leadership, and we get it wrong a lot. And we actually asked in our Facebook group for some examples of, as we've done before, when we have a topic coming up on the podcast, I like to find out from the listeners, like, what are you seeing in your own experiences? And we had a lot of examples of some really, really bad communication happening, didn't we?
People were not short on examples.
No. I'm sure they'll still be adding some today as well. But I think that we can get better. I think it's possible to learn to communicate more effectively. And so in today's conversation, we're going to talk about the importance of effective communication in leadership. And we're going to talk about some principles for healthy communication. So do you want to share, like, what is our perspective on what we're talking about when we use the word communication for this series?
Yeah. So just for our purposes and this conversation in this series, we are considering communication to include everything we say or do as leaders. So that means words or actions, nonverbal cues, tone of voice. I'm saying that one a lot because I say that all the time.
Yes.
Your tone of voice matters. Written messages, social media posts. These are all ways that we communicate with our audience, with the people that we are working with. So
people that we lead. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just a big issue. So
Yeah. All right. So let's start just by establishing why this matters. We kind of just hit on it a little bit, but what are some of the reasons that communication really matters for us as leaders? What do you think are some of the key reasons, Holly?
I think, as we kind of have already laid the groundwork, this is the foundation of everything we do. Communicating our vision or communicating the vision of the company or the ministry, we need to be able to communicate our expectations of people, challenges that we're working on, what's working, what's not, giving people encouragement, providing feedback. It all impacts the people that we work with and the team that we're part of. So it influences the message of what we're wanting to share. And honestly, it can either help what you're doing or it can hurt what you're doing.
Yeah.
And it's all about clarity. We have said before that people will join you because of your vision, but they'll leave because of your management. And the whole foundation of that statement is about communication. So communicating your vision clearly gets people to buy in to wherever it is you're going. But communicating the process all the way through helps people go there with you. So I think that really, in a nutshell, is why it matters that that we care about this. We want people to be part of our vision. And me personally, when I get to the end, if I get to the goal and it's a big win, I don't want to look around and see that I'm standing there by myself. I
Right.
want to have people with me, and communication is how we do that. So,
Yeah.
Esther, I'd love if you would talk about who we are communicating with. So, who is the target of our communication?
Yeah. So I think that sometimes when we think about this term communication, we just think about people on a big stage presenting to a huge audience, or we think about the CEO of the company, or we think about, the pastor at the church. And really that's not all that it is. That certainly does fall under that umbrella of communication, but we're talking about simply being an employee or a volunteer. You might be an employee or a volunteer and you're communicating to the people that you're working alongside. You might be leading employees or volunteers and you're communicating to them on a one-to-one basis or in a group setting. You also might be talking with your boss, your supervisor, your leader, the owner. So those people you're communicating upward to the people that are leading you. You could also be communicating with your industry colleagues, so people that are in the same industry as you, but maybe you don't work directly in the same organization. Of course, if you have any kind of online business or blog or speaking platform, then your audience that you are seeking to reach is who you're communicating to. And then just within our everyday lives, I mean, our family, right? Like every single day, I'm communicating with my daughter and my husband, and the way I communicate with them matters. And then I think, too, just even within your community, how you interact, how you communicate with people in your community. And we don't have this on the list, but I'm just going to throw this in here because I think social media,
Yeah.
every single post that you make on social media is communicating to your friends and your family and other people that
Yeah,
know you.
you're
So
absolutely
all
right.
of that is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that as you kind of already said, it doesn't only matter that it's in the workplace or a speaking stage. It's wherever you consider yourself a leader is where communication matters. So if you're leading your home over your children, how you communicate to them matters. So if you're in a Fortune 500 company in the boardroom, that matters too. So if you're speaking with someone one on one in a mentor relationship or a conference of thousands of people, it all matters. And so we don't talk about this to be intimidating or make it feel overwhelming, but just to bring awareness to the place that maybe you're not currently thinking about communication in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to talk about what happens when we don't communicate effectively as leaders and what are some of the consequences of not developing this skill as a leader, right? One of the things is it's going to be really hard for people to follow us and to respect us. And like you said before, to get on board with the vision. We might find we're saying things, we're communicating something, but we're looking around and no one is there because we're not communicating effectively and no one is actually getting on board and following. It also can create confusion within the team or organization when we are not communicating effectively because we are creating a lack of clarity, and it really makes it hard for people to know what is actually happening, what's going on,
Mm.
what am I supposed to be doing, who should I be talking to about this issue. That lack of clarity is really hard for people to be a part of. Another thing that I think happens sometimes when communication goes wrong is that it creates a culture of mistrust. So someone might hear something from the leader in one situation, and then they find out from someone else that the leader said something totally different in another group. And so now they're really unsure what to trust, who to trust, and how to figure out what is actually being said. So, can you think of any other examples, Holly, of this situation of communication gone wrong?
Yeah. So a lot of times when we don't communicate well, it can really cause hurt feelings and negative interactions that didn't even need to happen in the first place. A lot of misunderstandings and thinking that one thing's happening when it's in fact something totally different.
Yeah.
It also undermines our authority, either on a subject that we consider ourselves an expert in, or in a role that we're in. And so I think that kind of goes back to the culture of mistrust. People don't feel like they can trust you. And people really want to be able to trust authority figures or experts on things. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it causes people to lose sight of the end goal. And then they get frustrated and sometimes they leave or they just become apathetic. And so at that point, they've stopped really interacting with the vision and being able to really push it forward. So, yeah, all of those things can happen when we don't communicate effectively. And so I really think that it's important that we're having this discussion. And
Yeah.
I think it even makes sense for us to even talk about some really practical examples. So what does it actually look like? What's a practical example? Can you think of one, Esther?
Yeah, we've got some examples here of specific ways that this communication gone wrong might look like. So the first one I'm thinking of is when you say one thing but you really mean something else. And so an example of that might be in your company you might be saying the phrase the customer is always right. And we know that actually the customer is not always right. I mean, there are times when the customer is wrong.
Mhm.
And that just becomes like a cliche statement that people are saying around your organization. But what you probably want to communicate and what you should probably say is that customer experience is our number one priority. And so if you
Mhm.
say that, then you're not necessarily saying something different than what you mean. You know, you're being really clear about what the priority is in your organization and it makes sense to people. And they're not necessarily going to be sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, this customer is driving me crazy, but I have to think that they're right. You know?
Right, right, exactly.
Do you have another example?
Yeah, so I think elusive or vague statements or statements that are not really constructive, they don't really give any information. And this is especially important in one-on-one communication. So like I think about this most specifically when I'm talking about like feedback or employee reviews or something like that. For example, saying something like, you're just not really right for this promotion, or the company culture is going in a different direction. That doesn't really give anybody anything to work on, and it doesn't really tell them what the problem is.
Right.
So, what you could say is, we're really seeking someone that's a team player, and we don't really see that trait in you from past experience. That's a hard thing to say, but it gives that person something to work on and it gives that person somewhere to go. They can understand what's happening. Elusive or vague statements don't really bring clarity. And in fact, they just further confuse people. And like I said before, they get frustrated or they just become apathetic. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Another example would be when you are being hypocritical. So, in one setting, in front of employees, you are behaving a certain way, presenting yourself a certain way, following the rules, so to speak. But then in a different situation, you are completely acting differently. And
Mhm.
so, again, even though that might not even be the words you're saying, it's your behavior as a leader. And that is not going to be effective. People are going to be really frustrated, confused, annoyed by this miscommunication that you're giving them by behaving differently in different settings. So
Right.
that's really something to avoid.
Yeah. Another one that I have seen quite often are short term directives that don't sit in line with long term goals. So, what I mean by that is, and I think of this a lot more in the workplace or maybe even in ministry as well, but there's a long term goal that we all know that we're working for. But in the short term, we're expecting people to do something totally different that actually doesn't serve the long term goal. It's either a band aid or it is trying to work around something. And I get that those things happen to some extent, but you're really forcing people to go through like archaic processes that don't really match up with your long term vision. And that really starts the thought process within the employee or within the volunteer like, does this leader really get where we're going? Because we're constantly talking about this vision, but yet they're asking me to do these things that don't go in line with that. So that again creates confusion and people just really don't know where you're going because what you're actually doing is totally different than what the vision is. So that can
Yeah.
be difficult.
For sure. All right. Another way that ineffective communication can come out is when you have harshness or a really aggressive tone to communicate a point of disagreement. And this is a touchy topic right now, but I'm going to go there.
Go for
So I'm going to use an example that happened recently that I think we're all aware of. And that is the situation when John MacArthur was asked to give a one-word response to how the first thing that he thought of when hearing the word Beth Moore. And, that entire conversation that ensued after that, to me, it communicated something very different than I think what he ultimately probably wanted to communicate because of the tone of voice that was used, the attitude of the people that were in the conversation. And that was very ineffective. It was a very ineffective way to communicate a point of disagreement. And, we kind of had this conversation on my Facebook page, and I don't want to stir up any controversy on purpose, but I think the point that I'm making here is that you can disagree with people in a very effective way. I think that in Christianity, we are going to have things we disagree about. And there's going to be times when, as leaders in our organization, we are going to hold a different stance than some of the people we are following, or, there's going to be conflict. And how we go about disagreeing and the way we present ourselves in how we present our standpoint is really important. And a big part of that is our tone of voice, like you pointed out earlier. Tone of voice and the way you present your body language, all of that has a huge impact on how we come across to our audience, to people who are listening and following us.
Yeah, agreed. And I love that thought of, how we disagree totally matters because people are watching. And,
Yeah.
The harshness and aggressive tone, I mean, you can say, well, that's not what my words meant. But when you have a certain tone, people hear that, people see that, people take note of that. So
yeah,
so important. So another one is just being passive aggressive. And oh my gosh, this really gets to me. I can't stand this. Just say what you mean.
Ooh,
So
yeah.
these are issues where people are not necessarily talking directly about the problem, but they're making sort of veiled statements that are really expressing their frustration or resentment or bitterness. And it's so hard to get anywhere with that. In it, as a leader, you're really disrespecting the person that you're talking to as a human, as a peer that you can have a genuine conversation with when you do this. Yeah. And so it's really important to just don't do it. Yeah. Just don't be passive aggressive.
Just don't. I think the challenge with this one, and we were talking before we started recording, as we always do. And one of the challenges that we have, I think, within the Christian circles is this issue of wanting to be nice, right? And wanting to not ruffle feathers. And, I should really just try to seek to have peace. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we do things like passive aggressive communication because we think, well, I'm not actually saying anything directly mean to them, so therefore I'm doing the right thing.
Right.
But it's really an unhealthy way of communicating. And then this next one that I'm thinking of is also falls into that category, which is completely avoidance, completely avoiding the issue, not being willing to talk about the hard things. This is something that I kind of get on a soapbox about because I think it's a huge issue in the church that we want things to be easy and comfortable and nice. And so, we talked about this also, like the issue of grief and the issue of just going through difficult circumstances, depression, anxiety, stuff like that. Sometimes we avoid talking about those things because we don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But avoidance is a form of communication.
Yeah.
And it's an ineffective form of communication. That's not to say that there aren't times where we need to keep our mouths shut. There's definitely times that we need. I wish people could see your face.
I I was clearing my throat at the same time, so I moved my microphone, but you should have seen my face.
Yeah. So, and anyway, we're going to get into some of the principles of healthy communication, but, there are definitely times we need to just keep our mouth shut. But I think more often than not, people avoid dealing with difficult issues and difficult conversations, which ends up causing more problems down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And if we learned to communicate effectively about it from the start, we could actually have a much healthier church, a healthier workplace, a healthier team, healthier ministry, whatever the case might be.
And I find that especially avoidance and passive aggressiveness, if there's an issue, a lot of times people will react with these two types of ineffective communication when they personally don't feel like they have a solid grip on what's happening, or they feel like they can't address the situation because they haven't processed it themselves, or they don't have enough information, they haven't researched it. So a lot of times these are just emotional responses. They're not based on logic, they're not based on reasoning, they're not based on facts or the Bible or anything like that. They're just an emotional response. When in fact it's totally fine as a leader to say, you know what, I haven't done my due diligence on this topic and I can't address it right now.
Yeah. Right.
Period. End of sentence.
Yep. Yes. All right. So we've talked about why effective communication matters, and we've gone over a few examples of what it looks like when we miss the mark. And obviously, communication is probably one of the hugest topics that we could even try and tackle on the podcast. Yeah. And we are in no way going to cover all the examples or all the topics. I also want to mention that I'm not talking about, when we use the term communication, we are not talking about necessarily being eloquent in the way that you speak.
Right.
Because I'm not always eloquent in the way that I speak. And neither one of us are like experts on public speaking or communication in that way. But we're really, like we said at the beginning, we're really just talking more about the broad sense of how we are communicating a message in terms of what we say, how we say it, and also our behavior in how we are living out. Exactly. So we're going to kind of tackle some principles for healthy communication that might just be things that you can keep in mind to grow in this area, because I believe we all need to be growing in the area of communication, no matter what level of communication we are at currently. So let's jump into the first example of a principle for healthy communication.
The first principle is to really know your style. Self-awareness, as we talked about, it was one of the very first things that we covered in our podcast. It's key in leadership, but it's key in communicating effectively as well. If you know what your personal style or preference is, it will help you adjust your communication to the situation or person you are communicating with. So if you tend to be really direct or blunt and you're communicating with someone who's more sensitive, you might want to think about how you share the message with them without necessarily causing them any hurt. If you're someone who has trouble speaking up about issues, you might find it helpful to practice what you're going to say ahead of time, write it down, and review it before your meeting. So it's really important to kind of understand whether you are an emotional, relational communicator, or if you're more facts-based and analytical. And then it's also really important to assess who your audience is, whether it's kind of a mixed audience or whether it's one or the other, to be able to communicate effectively. Because a lot of times, as we talk about, how you're wired really makes up how you process information. And so sometimes it can really feel like people are speaking a totally different language when what they're saying doesn't match up with how your brain processes things. And so it's really important to be aware of at least your style. And then you can watch people's responses as you communicate and as you relate within your style, and figure out what's working and what's not, and kind of see how that goes for you as you move forward in communication and as you're in different places communicating with different people. And there's a lot that can be learned with how people react to your message. And you can learn from that based on where you are at.
Yeah. And I would say with that, this is really important to not use your style as an excuse to just barrel over people. I've heard it before where it's like, well, that's just my style of how I communicate. So basically just deal with it. And that's just not helpful. I know for me, I tend much more towards, I am a task-oriented person. I like facts and figures. I like to get to the bottom line. I do not like wasting time in meetings about fluffy stuff that doesn't matter, like talking about how everybody's day was. But I know that that actually does matter. And I know that that relationship piece matters. And so for me, the self-awareness piece comes in where I need to make an effort to take time to ask some of those relational questions, to spend a little bit of time catching up with people before diving into the meat of the conversation, so, and someone, like you said, that maybe is much more relational, they might have to work harder at getting to the actual topic of the meeting versus just staying in the fun conversational part.
Which I think
it's so
that's
important.
definitely me. Like, I'm the emotional relational side. And so when I hear you say that, I'm like, well, yeah, but I want to know how they're approaching this meeting. Like, how their day has been could make such a difference with how they're approaching the meeting. And it gives me a lot of information on what their feedback is to the topic. And so I need to have that information because I need to know, are you upset with what I'm saying about the facts, or are you upset because you were late to work because of your kids and because they wouldn't put their shoes on?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just like, okay, let's get to the point. Let's focus on what needs to get done tonight so that everybody can get out of here and get home, So this is why it matters, people. This is why it matters. Okay. I'm going to hit on the next 2 points because they're like passions for me. Okay. So the next one, I think, as a principle for healthy communication is to be honest. I think that no matter what your personal style is, it's really important to be honest when you are communicating as a leader. It doesn't mean that you tell somebody everything about a situation. If they don't need to be aware of all the details of a certain situation, then I don't think that honesty means you have to tell them. But I think it really is important to not lie or mislead a person or your team member. That should be fairly obvious, but somehow I feel like we're still missing the mark on some of that, right? Okay, so I'm going to keep that short. The next point is to be direct. Don't beat around the bush. Okay, so when we are communicating about anything, but especially when we are communicating about conflict or negative feedback, it's really easy to try and soften the blow by chatting for a while, easing into the conversation, but that almost always backfires and makes the other person feel used.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I don't know if you have heard of the job that I was previously in. We call it the sandwich, but it's basically a feedback sandwich. And some people need this. So I'm a person that needs it. I can't just have a blunt, you're doing this wrong. I need, like, we appreciate you, we value you, but here's what you're not doing right. But, go get them. We believe in you. Like, I need that.
Yeah.
But when you take 10 minutes for the first part of the sandwich to tell someone how wonderful they are, and then you slip in a sentence about what they're doing wrong or their critique or whatever the feedback is, and then you spend the last 10 minutes talking about how great they are, it just confuses people. It just buries your message and it's totally ineffective. So be aware of how you're using the feedback sandwich, because I think it's important for some people to be able to understand that you haven't lost all hope in their ability, but at the same time, you have to be able to communicate what's not working so that people can fix it. So be careful, make sure it's proportional. Don't bury it.
Yeah, the sandwich needs to be proportional. So really the time spent addressing the issue should probably make up the bulk of the conversation, and the before and after of, hey, you're awesome, and then, hey, keep doing these good things that you are doing. Like, those are kind of smaller pieces of the conversation, but they're still important to have there for sure. Okay, I'm going to give another example of this whole be direct thing because it's somewhat related, but it's a little bit different angle. But when I was doing my network marketing business, sometimes I would reach out to people and want to chat with them about my business. And so the purpose of calling them was to approach them about the business I was doing. Take it or leave it. You may or may not agree with that, but that's what was happening. when I did, I always tried to be really direct with them and let them know right up front why I was contacting them. So I would say, hey, Holly, I'm calling you because I am doing XYZ and I wanted to run it by you and see if you'd be open to hearing more. Instead of, hey, Holly, how are you doing? It's been so long since we've talked. And then chat with them for 20 minutes and then be like, oh, by the way, I'd also like to tell you about this thing I'm doing. How would that make you feel, Holly, if you were on the other end of that and you're like kind of the end of the conversation is the real reason I'm calling?
So I would feel definitely used and that you didn't think any of the stuff we were talking about before was important. Yeah.
Yeah. So just be aware for those of you who have a business or who have any kind of, even if you're calling someone about volunteering at church
Oh,
to be on a team, like don't spend the first 20 minutes just catching up with them about life. Go right to the point. I'm calling because we have a need. I really think you could be a good fit for this role. Would you consider talking about this possible volunteer role, whatever it might be? I just think that being direct is always going to be more effective than beating around the bush and spending a lot of time not saying what you actually want to say.
Yeah. And ask the person how they are afterwards.
Yeah.
Right. You don't have, it feels like you're being used if it's in the front of the conversation, but be direct, say what you need. And then if they say no to you, still ask them how they are. If they say yes to you, still ask them how they are, because it's really about communicating with the other person, not just what you need to get done, but also that you care about them.
Exactly.
So this next one goes right along with the last one. Be clear. Clarity wins. So it's slightly different, but it does relate. So clarity refers to the ability for the receiver to understand your message. So when you're speaking or sharing your message, is it actually clear to the person or the people on the other side what you're trying to communicate?
Yeah. So I think that oftentimes we as leaders have something that we're really, really familiar with that we're teaching or that we're leading people about. And it's so familiar to us, but we forget what it's like to be at the beginning stage of learning that topic or that area of expertise. And so we end up talking at like a level 10 when our audience is at a level 2. And we use terms and lingo that is common to us, but doesn't make sense to the people that are listening. So this is where that clarity piece comes in, that we really need to think through what we're saying from the eyes and the ears of the people that are listening. I think, for example, of pastors, where pastors just often have such a depth of knowledge around the Bible and around theology and around all the things that they are teaching. But they might have people attending their church well, they definitely have people attending their church that do not have that level of knowledge and understanding. And so it's really helpful for them, either on their own or with a team of people, to look at what they're preaching and whether or not that is going to make sense to the average listener, to the average American that's in their pews listening. Are they going to be able to understand it, or do they need to kind of break it down and explain it a little bit more? And just like for me, when I'm talking about technology and social media and podcasting, like all those terms and tech things are common to me. But if I'm talking to a friend or a neighbor or my mom, like I have to break it down and make it make sense and be clear.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I think we do sometimes as leaders is we overcomplicate things or we over-explain.
We definitely over-explain things.
Yeah. We probably over-explain things on the podcast sometimes. And I think there's a difference between over-explaining or complicating things versus repeating a communication message multiple times. And most people that are communication experts will say you do need to communicate multiple times the same message over and over for someone else to understand it. But we don't want to overcomplicate it and we don't want to over-explain. And I think sometimes that happens when we're not really 100% confident in what we're communicating or why we're communicating it. So we just keep talking and we just keep going and going and going. And we're just, again, then we just end up confusing people. So as Donald Miller says on the Story Brand podcast, when you confuse, you lose.
Ooh.
So the goal when we're communicating should be clarity.
Yeah. I think that really makes me think of just digestible bites of information. So when you're done communicating, if you're in like a speaker situation where you are talking for a while to people and you have a group of people listening, people should be able to walk out of your message and give like a one word or a one sentence, not one word, one sentence synopsis of what you said. If they are able to do that, then you've communicated effectively. Yeah, you might have talked for 45 minutes, but can they boil it down and get it into a digestible chunk?
Yeah, such a good point.
So the next one, and we don't need to belabor this because we're not going to over explain, but but be adaptable. So seeking to understand the other person that you're talking to, the group of people that are listening to you. Why do they want to hear your message? Why do they need to hear your message? Why does it matter to them? Does it match the audience? And I think a really important question to ask is, what barriers does the person have to hear what you're saying clearly? So the person or the audience, do they come in with a set of preconceived notions or a set of thoughts or mindset that would block them from understanding or digesting your message? So
Yeah, that issue came up in our Facebook group also when we were talking about this issue. Just the idea of being able to recognize your audience and who you're speaking to, knowing your own style, but also knowing the style and the language of your audience, it makes a huge difference. So you're obviously going to communicate a message differently to a group of kindergartners than a group of professionals
yeah,
in a corporate
absolutely.
workspace, right? So you're not going to try and go say the same exact words or in the same way to those two groups. So that's kind of an extreme example, but most of us don't have like such a difference of audiences that we're going to be speaking to. But whatever the case is, when you go in, knowing and being aware of who you're speaking
Yeah.
to is really important. All right. So the next one I think that we can keep in mind for effective communication is to pray and to be in God's word. This is really one of the best ways to communicate more effectively is just to be asking God to guide you in how you communicate. I mean, that again should be an obvious thing for us as Christian women, but sometimes I think we leave God out of some of these aspects of our leadership. So be sensitive to the Holy Spirit in terms of when to speak up and when to shut up. We mentioned that earlier, but sometimes effective communication is stopping and not saying something. Dig into God's word so that you can learn and follow the principles that God has set out for us as believers. The Bible does have a lot to say about our words, about how we communicate, about our behavior. So that's definitely something that we need to be keeping in mind as we move forward in effective communication.
Yeah. I love that one because a lot of times we think we can't do something or we can't do it well. We can't communicate our thoughts well or the message that we feel like God's given us. And the Holy Spirit is alive and active in us. And if he has a message he wants to communicate and you're willing to open your mouth, he a lot of times will give you the words that you need to say. He's the ultimate when it comes to the audience being able to understand, right? Because he's working in them, he's working through your words, and his word doesn't return void. So that's a big.
And that takes the pressure off of us too.
Yeah.
It means that we are not ultimately responsible for everything. We are obviously responsible for doing our part, but I often am praying for wisdom in how to communicate, especially directly in my own family. I mean, that's a big place I need wisdom on my communication because I do not always have the best words to say or the best way to say my words with the people that I love most. So it's a big area of wisdom.
They get a lot of our sort of raw emotions rather than the really well processed ones.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one for me, again, I'm going to try not to get on a soapbox, but be respectful and be respectable. So as we talked about, your conduct matters. How you say something is just as important as what you say. The person on the other end is watching how you handle yourself. And each interaction either gains you trust with them or loses trust, no matter how small the change is. In the trust level, it is either going to give you trust points, if you will, or lose trust points. And so if you treat the other person with respect and expect respect from them, then that only fosters trust and really builds that between the person. So, as I said, being respectful of the person, not name calling if you're disagreeing, not calling into question their integrity, being really respectful of the person that they are. Some things are just out of bounds to talk about. Just be careful with how you go about the person's integrity, and make sure that what you're saying is really well thought out and useful for
Yeah.
correction or
Yeah.
exhortation or whatnot. And on the other side of it, you need to earn and expect respect from those you're interacting with. So if the conversation stoops to a really low level, it's okay to excuse yourself or just say, I'm not going to go there. So you need to respect others and be respectable
Yeah.
in how you communicate with people.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to what we said earlier, just that how we disagree matters.
Mm,
So it's not just about the exact words that we say, but
yeah.
it's about the approach that we take in those conversations. And
Yeah.
it's absolutely impossible to be in any kind of working relationship, church relationship, family relationship, and to have zero points of disagreement. You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely. Yeah.
if you're in that situation, you're either not actually thinking for yourself, or I don't know. I just have never been in that situation, but I have a lot of opinions. So maybe I'm just different. But I'm in a lot of situations where I disagree with the people that I'm working alongside, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The issue is how I approach that disagreement.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's worth speaking up and addressing, and sometimes it's not. But to do so in a respectful way is so important.
Yeah.
So I love that you mentioned that.
Thanks.
So the next point that we have, and the next principle, is just to be genuine. And this kind of is one of those areas where, again, sometimes as Christian women, we have this perception that we need to just be really flowery in how we talk, or we need to be praising people all the time. And, you don't want to say things that you don't actually mean. And you don't want to say things just to be agreeable.
Yeah.
So if you're in a situation and you're in a meeting and something comes up and you don't agree, it's important to not just pretend that you agree. It's important to be genuine. And so just to think through, do I agree with this point or not? And if I don't, then again, I need to think about how I'm going to address it. And it's also important not to just be negative all the
Right.
time. And, so I'm not saying that being genuine means you get to just say mean things all the time. That's also not a good way to communicate. But, sometimes it's like, if you can't think of something nice to say, then don't say anything at all. Just
Mhm.
move on. Again, if it's not an issue that really needs to be addressed and it's just a small opinion that you have differently, maybe you don't actually need to say something about that.
Agreed.
So I'm not always the best at that, but it's important. All right. So Holly, do you want to share what our last principle is that we have here on our
Yes.
principles, which again are not an exhaustive list, but we didn't want this
Not an
episode to
exhaustive list,
be.
no, but it is a good long list, which
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So the last one is to be teachable. And we talk about this all the time on the podcast. We believe that leaders are learners. And I think when it comes to communication, my biggest way that I've learned to get better at communication is watching others communicate. People who do it well, when you're paying attention to how they do it well, it can be so educational for you. So I just encourage you to watch people who communicate well, take notes. If you see someone handle a really sticky situation well, ask them how they did it. Ask them what they were thinking. Ask them sort of if they had a guiding principle that was kind of in their mind while they were talking to the other person, or whenever they were handling the situation. I personally learn a lot from experience, but you have to understand how you learn. And so perhaps it's books, podcasts, courses, mentors, or coaches. Maybe it's self-reflection. There are so many different ways to learn, but it's really important that this is a area in your leadership that you don't forsake, that you don't take for granted, and that you're constantly pushing to get better at. Because if you have a message that you need to get out there, you have a vision that God has given you, or you have a company that you need to push forward, or you have a family that you need to lead, this is not something that can ever really go by the wayside. This is a lifelong skill. to effectively communicate with those around you and to really bring a message or to really encourage or exhort people towards whatever that end goal is. So I
Yeah.
think it's important.
Yeah. And I love that you pointed out the idea of like having mentors or coaches in there. I think that there are times when we are attempting to communicate something and we are just not we are not doing it effectively. And by simply having an objective outside perspective on what we're doing and how whether we're leading a meeting or whether we are speaking from stage or whether we are simply conversing, with our family. I mean, sometimes taking a minute to ask another person, how am I coming across to you right now? Or how am I coming across in the team meeting? How
Yeah.
am I coming across when I'm delivering my message on stage on Sunday or on Tuesday night, whatever it is? It can be really eye-opening, and that's kind of scary to do, but to get that outside perspective is part of being teachable and being willing to grow. And some of that is going to be painful. Some of it's you're going to hear some things that maybe you weren't expecting. But if you can use that information to take it and say, okay, maybe this is an area that I need to work on, and I need to work on how I present this information so that people can actually receive the message and not be focused on the things that I am doing that are hurting the message.
Right. I love that.
So we're wrapping this episode up, but I wanted to share that I am really excited that I am actually working on a resource for you, for anyone who wants to grow in this area and who maybe needs a little help with approaching hard conversations as a female leader and actually kind of knowing what to say during those hard conversations. For whatever reason, throughout my life, I have worked on having hard conversations, even when I have not wanted to. And I
Yep.
have learned just different things and different ways of approaching those hard conversations that have worked really well. And so I'm creating a resource called Confident Leader Scripts to provide for you guys. So, what I want you to do is if you're listening to this in real time, and you are hearing this like in November of 2019. This resource is coming soon, so you can get on the wait list at confidentleaderscripts.com. So head over there, sign up for the wait list, and when it's available, you'll be the first to know. You'll get more information about how you can grab that resource and start using it in your leadership. So I'm excited to provide that, and I'm really hoping it'll be a useful tool for you as you're growing in this area of communication.
That sounds like a really good resource, Esther. I think that's so exciting. And honestly, as someone who's known you for a while, you are not afraid to have the hard conversations and you do them really well. So you are a great person to be creating this. So
Aw.
well, go get it.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, it's funny, but I often will have people message me and say, oh, I need to deal with this situation. I need to deal with this client, whatever. What do I say? And
Mhm.
somehow God has given me an ability to just formulate those words. And I do not always get it right. I am sure there are times when I get it wrong, but I do love helping people figure out how to communicate what they need to say effectively. So I'm hoping this will be a helpful tool. So again, head over to confidentleaderscripts.com. You can also just go to the show notes for this episode, which will be estherlittlefield.com/episode 72. And you'll be able to find the link right in there and sign up for the waitlist. Or if it's available, you'll be able to find out more and grab it. So we want to thank you guys for joining us for this first episode in the communication series. I am really excited about the episodes that we have coming up, Holly. We're going to be talking about what to do when you mess up as a leader.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about issues of dealing with hard conversations, specifically in the workplace, with my friend Natalie, who is an expert in that area. We're going to be having just some really good conversations around communication and how to do it better.
Yeah.
So
We both really like this topic, so I think it will be really fun.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so before we wrap up this episode entirely,
Mhm.
we wanted to take a minute for those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while. You know Holly and I pretty well, and we wanted to give you guys just a little bit of a life update. So we mentioned at the beginning that Holly has kind of been missing from some of our episodes recently. I have been able to keep it going, but I've missed Holly a lot during this time. It's just so amazing to have her along with me on this journey. So, Holly, would you like to give everybody an update just on what's been going on for you and why you have missed some of the
Yeah.
episodes in the past couple
Yeah.
months?
So I first want to say a super big thank you to you for keeping this going because I know it's a lot of work. And it's true, I don't do a ton of stuff on the podcast. Esther handles 99% of it, but I did really miss it while I was away and while I wasn't able to record. But yeah, so without belaboring it too much, at the beginning of September, I found out that my dad had cancer. And that was on September 5th. And then by September 24th, he ended up passing away from pancreatic cancer. It was very, very quick. We didn't even have his full test results by the time
Mm.
he passed away, all the different pathologies and that sort of thing. So I live in Florida. My parents live in Maine. And so I pretty much flew up and was with them for most of that time. But yeah, it was one of those things that I just had to drop everything and just go be with my parents. It was a very difficult time. And although we had time to actually sit and say goodbye and really have that family time, it still went super, super, super quick. I was able to be there for the first week or so of September and really be with my dad and see him and talk to him and kind of be a part of that process. But then the second time that I went back, he was already non responsive and pretty much in full decline. So that was really difficult. If you follow me on Instagram, you probably saw some of my posts and or Facebook. And so I just want to say a big thank you to those people who were praying for my family, were praying for me. It's been difficult, but I really truly sense the Lord in every single step of the situation. I mean, he was there. Every single next hurdle, next challenge that we had, he was absolutely there with us. And so I attribute that to his magnificence and his sovereignty and his loving goodness, but I also attribute that to people praying really diligently for us. So, yeah, it's been weird to go through that grief, but I'm trying really hard to just take it day by day. And as Esther told me this week or last week, I can't remember when it was, I need to try to be really aware of what I'm expecting of myself and really go forth with sensitivity and trying to understand that this is a big deal and that I can't just expect to drop back into life full speed ahead. So,
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at.
Yeah. And, I think that it was a really hard thing to watch as a friend and to see your friend going through what you went through so quickly. It was just really, really fast. And for all of us who were praying for you, I know that we love you and we support you. And I know a lot of the women in the Purposeful Leadership group, although we didn't talk a lot about the details of what was going on, I know that a lot of the women in that group were very concerned for you and praying for you. And so we do appreciate everybody in that group that just were there to support you.
Absolutely. I couldn't have done it without that support. And we, because of your willingness to step out in prayer for me and my family, we just felt God so near. And so he just really bathed that situation with his love and his grace. And I'm really, really thankful. So,
Yeah. So
yeah.
this episode, we're kind of wrapping up with not a fun question, but more of just a real life question. And just the fact is that sometimes life is just really hard. And even when we are on the outside, sometimes things look normal and fine. And really sometimes people are experiencing just things that you could never imagine. And I guess my encouragement for us as we're wrapping this up is I guess this kind of wraps up our conversation on communication, that when we're communicating with people, we just never know what they may be going through. And I think keeping that in the back of your mind at all times can be really helpful as a leader, because your team members, the people that you love, the people that you don't know that you're speaking to, the words that you say and how you say them can either bless them or they can completely discourage them.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good way to wrap it up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I appreciate it.
So as we close out, we just want to encourage you to come back and listen to our upcoming episodes about communication. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and we will talk to you next week.
Yeah. Next time we'll have a fun question.
Yes, we will do a fun question for the next episode when it's you and I together, Holly.
Perfect. Sounds great.
All right. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.